Hello, I'm Harry Chapman, Lighthouse Counsel Senior Consultant, broadcasting from our office in Franklin, Tennessee. Welcome to our Giving USA 2025 briefing. Giving USA is the longest-running and most comprehensive report on the sources and uses of charitable giving in America. It's published by the Giving USA Foundation, a public service initiative of the Giving Institute, of which Lighthouse Counsel is a proud member firm. This marks Lighthouse Counsel's fifth Giving USA briefing, provided as a service to the sector. In this briefing, you'll learn about the recently released Giving USA 2025 report and critical insights on economic developments and donor trends. Providing today's briefing on Giving USA 2025 is Lighthouse Counsel Senior Consultant Dr. Lilya Wagner. Lilya has been one of the nonprofit sector's leading authors, speakers, trainers, coaches, and practitioners for over 3 decades. As an Associate Director for Public Service and Director of the Women's Philanthropy Institute at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, she oversaw curriculum, preparation, and revision for the fundraising school and conducted training, speaking, and consulting in more than 80 countries. An award-winning author, she has written over 16 books. Following will be a panel discussion with leading experts on philanthropy, moderated by Lighthouse Counsel's John O'Kane. And now for an overview of Giving USA 2025, Dr. Lilya Wagner.
In the brief time that I have with you, I will share some of the main points of Giving USA and share also some perspectives on how this can be used in our practice. During this session, I'm going to highlight who gives and to whom in the United States. This is very relevant information for at least to have a groundwork on what's happening with philanthropy in America. I've been a long-time professional in fundraising, and Giving USA has certainly been a good guide for me in several ways, with a few cautions. Giving USA has been producing these reports for quite some time, and I found that when I was in active practice as a fundraiser, not just as a consultant, that I was able to have a good feel for what was happening, because people influence each other when it comes to how you support a nonprofit cause. We have some that become popular, some that fade from the view, some that die, unfortunately, because that means somebody isn't getting served. But understanding what is the philanthropic culture and mentality is certainly a very worthwhile endeavor for us to spend some time with. We also have to understand that there are factors that might make us feel like, okay, we don't meet the norm if we look at the whole picture, the big picture. There are factors such as circumstances, environmental causes, and I mean what's happening in our community or in our particular type of nonprofit. There are also factors that we couldn't predict, such as COVID, which definitely affected giving. Then there are other factors that during COVID, people tended to give more personally. Certainly, I know that I did. I would see a family in my community that they'd lost their jobs, they were in desperate situations, and I would give without going through any organization. These are some of the factors that we have to consider as we, at least mentally, are prepared to apply this kind of information to our own practice. The good news is that last year, 2024, American giving increased. Philanthropy was getting a footing again. I probably watched these figures for about 25 years or more. And it's always been interesting for me to see how some causes in our country and in our environment affect how people tend to be philanthropic. The good news really is that in philanthropy increased in 2024, even if adjusted for inflation. Total giving grew by 3.3%. This is good news for us. Now, some causes lost a little bit, but in general, people have not lost the mentality of generosity in our country. And I'm particularly thankful for that for two reasons. I was a refugee kid, and it was a lot of American philanthropy that helped us get a footing in this country and become successful citizens. Also, I have worked globally in over 101 countries, and I can see the comparison, and I'm grateful. While there, of course, is generosity everywhere, to some extent at least, I'm grateful that I have been generous. So let's look and see who to whom, and then consider some of the variables again. Here we can see an interesting pie chart that I have followed for many years, and I think it's good news that giving by individuals is truly the most generous aspect of our giving picture. Individuals have been active in giving to the greatest extent. That to me says a lot about how our nonprofit sector, our organizations can continue to serve our populations. Then giving by foundations. Foundations, of course, as you know, are set up for the purpose of giving. And giving by foundations has been a generous factor also. Now, two segments of this particular pie chart have been affected lately. One of these is giving by bequest. This is when people make a will where they choose to leave their money, family, to someplace else, but also to some nonprofit organizations. This, of course, is an area that can see a lot of growth in this country. As I have studied some of the figures on who gives, who makes bequests and who gives in that way, there's a lot of room left for growth there. For one thing, it benefits the donor. It makes sure that our resources are wisely used when we pass away. Then giving to corporations has traditionally been the smallest part of the giving pie. But we have to remember something very critical. Corporations also give in other ways, in-kind gifts, services. We have to look at the full picture to understand how corporations do actively act in philanthropic means. And we have to put that into perspective when we are planning our particular outreach. This is a very important groundwork when we do our fundraising plan for the year and for the future. Who can give and who would give? Of course, that goes into a lot more of our training points, but this is a good foundation for our planning for the next year. How do we approach it? Where does this money go? This is an interesting factor because I have watched this over time, and there are some societal circumstances and changes that affect giving. Of course, that makes sense. But giving to religion has dropped significantly from the first time that I started following this information and using it in my own practice. Giving to religion is less than half than it used to be, let's say 25 years ago. You, of course, have probably heard that America has become increasingly unchurched. This has caused, as we know, an epidemic of loneliness. And now I have also seen in the literature and in activities that people are going back to church. So this will be one factor of where the money goes that it will be very interesting to watch. And there's also a corollary to that. When we look at some of the reasons why people give, which we will do shortly, one of the things that we can remember is that there are religious motivations to a lot of giving, to a lot of generosity. Some religions actually require it. Some people say it's up to you, but it's a good idea. So we have to remember that this is a major influencer. And of course, we need to track how do people give to religion, because this is a very varied picture. Then we go to human services, and I'm very glad that Americans are generous in this particular area, because I myself was a recipient of this type of generosity that helped me get started as a kid here in the United States and helped me grow to be a productive adult. Then we see giving to education, which is the third largest. I remember years ago, education was jockeying for second position with healthcare. One reason that I bring this up is to point out how factors affect our nonprofit sector, and therefore generosity is affected also. Major changes in how healthcare is provided, and also when we have some of the corporate factors that come into healthcare, this affects giving. And as wise professionals, we need to be aware of, as we said earlier, the bigger picture. And then you can see what some of the others are. International giving tends to vary depending on how we view the rest of the world and what our interactions are. So these are very important factors for us to remember. Where does the money go and where do we fit? And how do we position ourselves to secure some of these funds? So as we review the key findings by each one of these subsectors of the nonprofit sector, we can look at what has grown, what has stayed stagnant, and internally, let's think what has affected. For example, if my organization is a social service, what has happened in that field? What has happened in my community? What has happened with my particular organization? And how does it fit into this overall giving picture? This is where this kind of information, it's not just research that stands alone and is interesting to look at, but it's research that can truly help guide our practice. And it's credible research. It's been done for quite a while, and it is using the very best research tactics. And I do want to stress that. So we will look at the giving by the various sectors that we saw in the pie chart. That giving by individuals is a growth of 5.1% when adjusted for inflation. Now, this is a good factor. We may think 5.1% isn't that great, but look at how much was given. And that's the same kind of mentality with which we need to approach the other donor groups. Foundations, giving by foundations stayed pretty much flat. That is quite understandable. Foundations have some very defined desires for where they will give their money, and it behooves us to do our homework when we approach foundations. Regrettably, in my past professional experience, I've had, for example, board members say to me, oh, just write a grant and get the money. First of all, we write proposals. We don't do the grant writing. Then secondly, do we fit under their priorities? And this is where a good piece of education can come in as we talk to our board members or even our donors about where the money comes from and how do they fit. I mentioned giving by bequest. I believe that some of our recent years' occurrences, such as COVID, have had an effect on this. I know that I have noticed sort of an attitude of fatalism. Well, this is a disease that has killed so many. What's my future for it? And so we need to understand that there are some environmental circumstances that affect how people give. I still want to reiterate that bequests are an area where almost all organizations, and I have done training for several thousand as well as consulting, There are quite a few organizations that really don't tap into this particular way of giving, and it's a way to ensure that we will have some donations in the future. One of my early jobs was to raise funds for a higher education institution that had gone into serious debt. I had been on the faculty there, and every now and then a bequest would mature, and it was such a blessing, not only in reality, but also psychologically. Then I've already mentioned this matter of giving by corporations. It grows little by little. I know in the early years when I looked at this, it was maybe 5%, and it has grown a little bit. Again, as we look at these percentages, it's important to look at them as compared to the total of giving. So a growth of 6% when adjusted for inflation is very good for our future in getting corporate giving. Now, giving to religion has been an interesting area for me to follow and track and also analyze myself. First of all, I'm interested in giving to religion because I'm a preacher's kid. But more than that, it was religious groups that helped us become Americans, adjust to American ways, get us settled. So for me to see the great drop in giving to religion over the last years, or even decades, has been both a little bit dismaying, but also very interesting to observe. For example, COVID definitely had an effect because people couldn't go to church, and many went there for the sense of belonging, for a sense of being part of something, for family, so to speak. COVID did away with a lot of that, and subsequently we saw that there was an epidemic of loneliness going on. For me, that was a time and a place where nonprofits could fill in the gaps by helping people again acquire that sense of belonging. Now, when we're seeing a reemergence of interest in religion from various angles, it will be very interesting for us to observe what happens in the next year here in 2025. Will something change? Certainly, this is an area that we can be very conscious of because, as I've mentioned, religion is one of the motivators for why people give. So it's very vital to the overall picture. Then giving to human services hits home to me because it was human services that, as I've already mentioned, helped us become citizens here in America. And I'm glad that there was growth there as well. Then giving to education has always been very important for me, and I'm glad that it is such a place where generosity really shows up. An educated population is certainly very important for our overall national success. So I'm glad to see that education, when you look at the adjustment for inflation, did grow quite a bit. Then giving to foundations, and of course, because foundations can be a good market if we define our cause well, stayed flat, but I'm really glad to see that it didn't drop. Then if we look quickly at some of the others, that if your organization belongs to one of these, it's critical for you to understand this, and we don't have time to go into detail, but I would encourage you to look more thoroughly at the research itself to see how your organization fits. Looking at the public and society benefit organizations, they grew by 16.1%, which is good. And then finally, giving to health, there was a little bit of growth there. And international affairs, of course, these are frequently affected by global affairs. So being aware of what's happening in the world out there is quite critical for us if this is the type of organization that we work with, as I did once. Understanding what happened in the former Soviet Union was, of course, very important to me And there was a growth of nonprofit interest in those countries, as well as interest in philanthropy itself, because my country of origin was one of those. And also I was sent to do a lot of training in these countries. It was very interesting to see how what happens globally is affected by and is also an affecting nature to overall philanthropy in America. So this is a quick look at who receives the money. Giving to arts and culture and humanities, which of course I have an interest since I'm a musician as well. It is a place that adds to our lives, completes our lives, and I'm also glad to see that this grew by 6.4%. Then giving to environmental and animal organizations also grew, which is good. Now, giving to individuals wasn't always part of this pie chart. So it's interesting how this may have changed. And I believe once again that the events of the last couple of years have certainly affected this particular factor. And I want to reiterate that there are ways that people give to individuals that are not recorded in the research. For example, giving a handout to the person on the street, which I always do, or being able to participate in a social medium that is raising money for something, and that doesn't always show up. So it's good to consider that giving to individuals is a critical factor, and we may not have the entire picture here because of these mitigating factors. Unallocated giving, that means people give that without definitely defining where it's supposed to go, is also an interesting factor, and it dropped in giving last year. This is the difference between giving by source and use in a particular year. So unallocated giving, and of course, we who serve organizations, we definitely want people to be very clear as to where their money goes. And one of the things that I just stressed earlier today as I was doing a mini training was people give to outcomes. People give to what you promise will change and be different and be better. And so it's no wonder that unallocated giving is at this particular stage. As we look as a little bit of a summary at the next slides, and I do want to express great appreciation for those who do the research and compile Giving USA. Certainly the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University deserves major thanks for being part of this whole effort to find out how is America philanthropic. Here we can do a comparison of giving in the previous year and giving last year. You can see, as we've already mentioned a couple of times, bequests, where I continue to believe there is room for growth because it's beneficial to both the nonprofit as well as a donor. That's where one area of possibility lies. And we can see what the difference in giving is. There are giving increased by total, which I'm very encouraged about. Giving by individuals increased also. And the others increased a little bit, not as much as in 2023, but it's very encouraging to see this. And again, I reiterate, because I'm so committed to this idea, there is possibility in the matter of bequests. Okay, so looking here at the changes in giving by source, this is also interesting. Individuals, their giving grew. Foundations was almost flat. Corporations, their giving grew. And I won't belabor the point, but we know what we can do with bequests. So here is just a quick look quick summary. I'm not going to go over each one of these by giving to the particular causes that we have addressed earlier. It's good to look at this, good to see what has changed from the previous year, what's better, where do we have possibilities for growth. Ultimately, of course, it comes down to some very good fundraising principles that the fundraising school, part of the School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, espouses. How do we do responsible, good fundraising? How do we make a case for our cause? How do we answer the question, so what? What difference does our organization make? And then from there, we move to looking at who cares? Who cares about our cause, or who could care about our cause? And definitely there is growth. I have observed this growth over a long period of time in my professional jobs as a fundraiser. And it always encourages me to see how people at economic levels can be convinced to care. So in summary, just want to reiterate that this research is very credible, done by professionals housed in professional organizations. It is verifiable. The comparisons with previous years are always helpful. We do need to consider what are some of the mitigating factors, what causes the bumps, what causes the changes, what causes the increases as well as decreases in giving, what are the changes in the nonprofit sector. Ultimately, we can use this in our planning, in our understanding of what can happen by looking at what has happened in our particular type of organization. And definitely this is information that our boards should understand. So they won't be saying to us, oh, just go get the money. That there is a science and a practice that is verifiable. The United States has had a long tradition of philanthropy, of nonprofits who have served our communities, our citizens, our country. And I have been so privileged to be part of that. And Giving USA shows the bigger picture, but also helps us as individual professionals, as it has me. So I wish each of you the best as you consider this and how it affects your particular practice. Best wishes.
Thank you, Lilya, for that enlightening summary of this year's Giving USA report. Now, to share insights into what is happening in the nonprofit sector across the country, Lighthouse Counsel's John O'Kane will be joined by our stellar panel of nonprofit leaders. Over more than 5 decades, John O'Kane has worked with hundreds of nonprofit organizations as a staff member, executive director, consultant, volunteer, board member, and professor. John was a distinguished adjunct professor of practice at Georgia State University Andrew Young School of Policy Studies, Department of Public Management and Policy. We are honored to have John of Counsel with Lighthouse Counsel. I pass it over to you, John.
Well, welcome, panel. I'm so happy to have you today. What a distinguished panel we have to look at this year's results from the Giving USA survey. That survey is something we always look forward to reviewing. And I want to thank Lighthouse Counsel for making this available to us and for our peers there in the community. Before I start, I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel that has a nice representation of the whole fundraising panoply, if you will. First of all is Meredyth Cole. Meredyth, if you'll raise your hand, just like in school, there you go, very good. Meredyth is head of school at the Levitt School in Atlanta, K-12 school, where she's been since 2018. Prior to that, she was at the Episcopal School of Dallas, and in both of those settings worked on major campaigns. So I think that brings some real expertise to us. Also, prior to those two assignments, she had a 23-year tenure at the Madera School, where she was assistant head of school and acting head of school. She has a BA degree from the University of Virginia and a master's in Science of Educational Leadership from the University of New England, and also was a National Association of Independent School E.E. Ford Scholar in 2003. Meredyth, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate that. Rosalyn Merrick Hand is the president and CEO of Atlanta Habitat for Humanity. She joined very propitiously in November of 2020, nice timing, as Chief Development Officer. She was promoted later. She obviously survived COVID, was promoted in January of 2023 to Executive VP and Chief Operations Officer, and then promoted to recently, I think about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, to President and CEO of Atlanta Habitat. Previous roles, career roles she's had have been with the Georgia Community Foundation, Mount Vernon School, the Ron Clark Academy, the United Way of Greater Atlanta. She is a magna cum laude graduate of Georgia State University and a native Atlantan. Belinda Dinwiddie Havron, is that right? Havron is right?
That's correct.
Is the Chief Development Officer with Musicians on Call. A very, very interesting mission. And the mission of that Nashville-based nonprofit brings live and recorded music to the bedside of patients, families, and caregivers in healthcare environments. And Belinda is there especially to work on a strategic plan to see how to expand that wonderful mission that they have. Belinda has nearly 40 years as a nonprofit professional and served 17 years prior to that with the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. She has served on numerous boards and committees to mention, very, very active in the greater Nashville area. And lastly, Jay Stroman. Jay is the Senior VP of Advancement and Alumni Affairs and the CEO of the University of South Florida Foundation. Prior to going there, he was in his career in higher education, he served as Senior Associate Vice President for Development and Alumni Affairs at the University of Georgia, Vice President for Advancement at Young Harris College, and also at Mercer University. He earned his bachelor's degree in business management from Mercer University. So I think those watching can realize what an incredible representation we have here on the panel, and especially the kindness that you've offered with your time and your expertise. So thank you so much. I am serving as your panel moderator, John O'Kane, most recently professor of practice for 31 years in the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University, and currently serving of counsel with Lighthouse Counsel, who are sponsoring this seminar. So the first I want to start with a big question, and then we'll drill down into some of the specifics coming from the Giving USA. So as you look back on this past year of fundraising, the Giving USA study mentions that $592.5 million was given charitably in the United States. That's a 6.3% increase in current dollars and a 3% increase when adjusted for inflation. Given those numbers, which of course can be disparate depending on which nonprofit you're with, if you could identify just the most significant thing you saw over the past year as related to fundraising for your organization. May I ask Meredyth to start off with that?
Sure. John, it's interesting. I think my answer goes directly to this idea of increased giving. We saw much more multi-generational interest in giving to the school. So where we had former parents bringing their adult children in to be part of the conversation and part of the decision making as it related to investing in a gift here at Lovett, and it had a great impact to our bottom line.
Excellent. Jay, with Meredyth, of course, K through 12, you're in the higher education sphere. How about the single most thing you noticed?
John, thanks for having me. Much like what the Giving report says, we've seen an increase in donor participation across the university, which is great way for more people to get involved at the university. And we've again seen a record-breaking fundraising year for the university.
Very good. Rosalyn, how about for Habitat?
Yeah, thank you, John, for the opportunity and the discussion. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge how great that we can talk about an increase in overall giving year over year. So grateful for all of us for that. And at Atlanta Habitat, we are blessed to have really generous, loyal corporate partners. And so I'm not at all surprised to see that that was one of the largest increases year over year for some corporations. I think that we are well positioned to partner with our companies here in Atlanta. And if nothing else, purely from a corporate social responsibility standpoint. It's easy to draw lines of alignment between our work in creating affordable homeownership opportunities and many of the priorities for our corporate partners here. And whether it's that they care about the environment, health outcomes, or veterans, we say there's a really big table to serve here at Atlanta Habitat, and there's room for everyone. So we've kind of dug in deep on that and continue to cultivate strong corporate relationships in support of our home builds, but also as we elevate whole communities around affordable homeownership.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Belinda.
Yes, good morning, and thank you again. I'm excited to be here and hear what everybody else has to say. Also, for me, when we talk about the individual, we could talk about different parts, but an individual is one of the basic things. I think you cannot do special funding, endowments, a lot of things until you have a really sustainable individual giving program in most organizations. And I know that Habitat's a little different than that. So we've spent a lot of time and have seen an increase, particularly in gifts. We moved our major gifts up from about 5,000 to about 25,000 to look at that, but also to focus on that middle range so that we feel for our growth, we have to have sustainable growth and sustainable individual giving, which tends to come back year to year. And that's been a focus. And I was pleasantly surprised that the community was as receptive to that.
Excellent. Wonderful comments and lovely brief comments so we can move right along. This is excellent and very relevant, I might say, to those who are listening. But let me pick up, Belinda, on that point about individual giving. Overall, the Giving USA report showed that 66% of all the giving was from individuals. Now, that's a little deceptive because it doesn't include family foundations and bequests. And if we factor that in, we're probably up around 80% or so. The individual giving represented an 8.2% increase in current dollars and 5.1% when adjusted for inflation. And I know y'all are ecstatic because those numbers are up. But the other thing we're seeing is the number of donors are decreasing, even though the amount of money is going up. So my question is, what are you each doing to attract new donors and then to retain them? And I'm going to go backwards because I'm going to start with Belinda because you mentioned that in your previous comment.
Well, I think for us, I have to say that going back again, just a little bit saying what I said before, but going back to the basics, making sure that we are doing the right things in cultivation, in stewardship, particularly in giving people the opportunity to know more about us. We're using social media a little more than we had in the past of doing it, but also looking at our volunteers. We have never really looked at volunteers as a resource. They volunteer your time. Should we be asking them for money? And have found that volunteers are giving other places. They might as well do. So I keep reiterating with my staff that the basics is what it is. Cultivation, stewardship, and information are really the key factors for individual giving because they tend to return time and time again.
Very good. Anybody else want to comment on the individual giving?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. And plus one, everything that Belinda said, especially around going back to basics, but also remembering to ask our volunteers. And the way that we position that is, can you match your contribution of time with contribution of dollars as a starting point? And most people find that to be accessible and easy enough to do. But we really do invite all stakeholders to give. There's that old adage that if you don't ask, you don't get. So we're really intentional about asking everyone, whether it's our staff, our vendors, even our volunteers, of course, as I mentioned, our program participants, but certainly not forgetting about the folks who supported us in the past. So going back to lapsed donors every year to re-invite them to come alongside of us. And lastly, I would just say, we've learned that more frequent high-touch engagement makes a huge difference. So we've actually gone smaller and more casual with our events, all in person post-pandemic, which provides more meaningful connection and conversation. And that's really been a winning strategy, and including our program participants and donors, like giving them an authentic included role, whether they're speaking or sharing their story or really helping plan that event from their perspective about what appeals to other people. Are some of the strategies that we've deployed to attract more donors but sustain the ones that we have.
Very good. Jay or Meredyth, would you add anything about individual giving?
I would echo what Rosalyn just said. We too have found that providing smaller venues, sort of more intimate, small gatherings where we really can effectively tell our story and talk about impact, we've seen really strong response from that.
Good.
John, I would just say, knock on wood, we've been fortunate to see our donor count actually go the other way, increase at the University of South Florida. And I think it's the way we tell our story, the impact people have. People need to see themselves giving in all different ways. And I think the university, we've done a really good job reaching out, not only across the country, but also internationally, globally, as our university pulls more people in to try to show them how they can have impact on all across our university. And so far, it's gone really well.
Very good. Rosalyn touched on the corporate giving, and we saw that's probably one of the biggest increases in the Giving USA study this year. It grew by 9.1%, 6.1% when adjusted for inflation. Interesting, the average giving from corporations pre-tax is 1.1%, which may not sound like a lot, but that's actually up 0.3% since 2019, right before COVID. So we've talked a little bit, Rosalyn's talked a little bit about the importance of corporations. I'm going to come to you maybe last, Rosalyn, and ask the other folks to comment on how they tie in corporations. And Jay, I'd like to start with you, because you would think, at the higher education and even K through 12, Meredyth, you think of individuals, but you also have those pretty great opportunities for companies to be involved. Could you start us off on that point, Jay?
Sure. Everybody's experience is probably going to be a little bit different, but I would say at the university level, corporate giving, I used to say, is an oxymoron a little bit, because usually they're coming in looking for talent first. They want our students. They want to be able to hire. They also want to fund research with our faculty. So it's a little bit different fundraising agenda for us at the university level, for sure. We certainly rely on our corporate partners. We advocate and have a lot of corporate partners, but the giving isn't as intense, I would say, as some of the other areas that you pointed out, John.
Yeah. Meredyth, what about at the K through 12?
We actually, John, don't see a lot of, we don't sort of have a big corporate strategy. We do see it through matched gifts, and annual fund is probably where we see the biggest impact with corporate giving. Beyond that, we are not, we don't have a strategy to partner with corporations.
Okay. And Belinda, it's very interesting because when we think about corporations, I also think about the musicians you work with who are their own corporations in many ways. They're their own businesses. So you might have a unique perspective on that.
Yes, there are a couple things that are unique about us. One, we're a national organization, as is Habitat, but we have programs all over the country. And then we do have uniqueness because we are in a city where a great deal of the musicians and people with their own businesses are there. What I think we have found, because about 25% of our funding has been coming from corporations through their either corporate philanthropy, they want to be a good part of their community, or through deliverables that we are able to do, because we can do a national chain or a national organization that has presence in different communities, and be able to do that, to look at doing something in Phoenix at the same time that you're doing something in New York. So we are able to expose their markets a little differently. So I think we have spent a lot of time looking at national organizations that will benefit, or things that, but we're also kind of focusing now on the individual communities, of looking at creating those pipelines of who are the corporations there that want to be support, looking at us from that avenue. And as we said, we are lucky to have a revenue stream, because we can provide artists sometimes for events that these organizations, these corporations have, which is a different deliverable. Not everybody has, but I would say that if I was just looking in general of corporate, that I think that you look at the corporate philanthropy side without deliverables, because that the corporations do want to be a part of that. And so I do think that can increase your pipeline and do some of the same kind of things. You got to cultivate and steward those donors the same way.
Yeah. And Rosalyn, if I remember our previous conversation, maybe about 60% of your income is earned, right? And then the other 40% raised. So did the corporate dollars come from the 40% side?
Well, a good memory, John. Actually, it's flipped. So 40% of our revenue is earned and 60% is fundraised. But to your point, the largest portion of our fundraised revenue does come from our corporate partners. And I would say one of the best things we can bring to the table in the conversations that we have with them is, one, authenticity, to really talk about our needs and interests on both sides of the table, but also creativity. I spent a lot of time explaining the depth and breadth of Atlanta Habitat's work and mission, so people really see us for all that we are, and we treat our corporate partners the same way, to really see all the full bounty of what they bring to the table and get really creative in our thinking. So as they think about their marketing needs or ability, how they want to engage their employees, excuse me, whether that's team building or professional development, what needs they have around engaging their business partners in a really authentic way, what in-kind donations of products or services or even talent they're willing to offer. And last but not least, what vendor relationships they hold that they may be able to leverage for our benefit for something that we have a need around. So just to be really thoughtful, broaden your thinking and your imaginations around all the ways you can partner is part of how to really tap that corporate potential.
Yeah, when I think back 50 years to raising money from corporations, everything was pretty much local at that time. Maybe you had a few companies in your town that were national, and it's just totally flipped. So in many ways, working with corporations means you have to look at that sort of regional or national perspective and not just the local. But thank you very much. Now I want to go to one of our favorite topics, foundations. And 1 out of every 5 charitable dollars, based on the study, comes from a foundation. The interesting thing, of course, is that the foundation's assets are growing significantly as the stock market has been doing well. And so there seems to be a much bigger pot that foundations can give. And how do we access that? So let me just throw that open for whoever would like to start that part of the discussion off.
No, it's interesting. And Rosalyn, I wonder if you're benefiting from this change that we're seeing at the independent school level. So certainly family foundations continue to be very generous partners for us. The larger foundations in Atlanta, post-COVID, seem to be backing off independent schools a little bit. They still remain committed to us and supporting us, but at a much different level than they have historically, and they are turning to more human-based needs of the community, which I think in many cases is their mission. So that makes sense. But we, as independent schools, are seeing a little bit of a decline in the giving levels of the largest foundations in Atlanta.
Interesting. Other comments on foundations?
I think that for us, we do get a good bit from foundations, and part of that I think is as an organization always to look at the different type of programs you have and what they will do. For example, I know in Habitat you have anything from financial security to affordable housing to different things, and in our case we get to look at we do programming for veterans. So there are particular foundations that focus just on veterans and don't want to do something else. Or there could be something we work with a partner, Hyundai, who is very much into cancer, childhood cancer. And so because we do a childhood programs in hospitals for children, we have availability of doing that. But we have really spent a lot of time of looking at what are the different types of things that we do, and then how do we turn that into working with a particular organization, a particular foundation. And again, that also helps us because we do have programs in different cities. So if we have a program there, we can go to a foundation there if they are into that. But narrowing it down to what are some of their focuses, because I think we sometimes think there's money there, they ought to give to us, and sometimes we just don't fit.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah.
I would add a little perspective to that too, and just again aligning with what Belinda and Meredyth already shared. I do think there's a lot of demand right now for foundation support around basic needs, particularly given where things are with the economy and lots of other feeling of uncertainty in the environment. They understand they're going to have to be the stopgap funding source for a lot of different organizations. And then on top of that, so we do benefit from some of that. You're right, Meredyth, but only because just now have we started having different conversations. Traditionally, foundations have supported us in capital campaigns, particularly around infrastructure. So whether it was creating our headquarters, opening up a new restore location, or infrastructure for planned development that we did, we've never gone to them really and asked for programmatic support. And so that's a different discussion that we're having with foundations today. And like with any other donor, really know your audience. What do they care most about? And foundations will lead with, we care about impact and leverage. How are you going to leverage this contribution to bring others to the table? So we kind of back into that by showcasing, here are all the other companies, individuals showing up. Can you match what they're providing so that we can achieve this level of impact for this specific program? And so far, that's been well received.
Very good. Very good. Jay, any comment from the higher education perspective?
Yeah, I would just say foundations are one of the greatest areas of growth for us in higher ed. At University of Georgia, I started a whole foundation team focusing on foundations, getting out to visit them, understanding what they wanted to invest in. Here at South Florida, we also have a foundation team. And so we look regionally, we look nationally. You can always find things that foundations will support, but you got to get to know them. You got to build relationships. And you have to be able to tell your story so they'll want to give. But I think it's an area of opportunity that everybody across the country, if you don't have a foundation strategy, you definitely need to get one.
Very good. Maybe that's a nice transition into sort of the personal foundations, the famous donor advised funds that we're seeing occurring, where donors don't have enough money to establish their own foundation, or they don't want to establish their own foundation. What we saw in the Giving USA study is that 53% of individual gifts to community foundations were donor advised funds, where the donor wanted to continue to have some say or some role over how that money was spent. In fact, 30% of the donor advised funds to community foundations were made from those earning $50,000 to $200,000. So there seems to be a sweet spot in that middle, if you would. And Belinda, having worked with the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, let me start off to see what you might have been seeing about DAFs.
Well, they are a wonderful source. I mean, the majority, not majority, but a tremendous amount of individual giving that we do get at Musicians on Call does come from individuals who have DAFs. Because as I had a board member when I was at the Community Foundation who used to say, that money we've already spent that money, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That money is away; it's not coming out. So it's kind of set aside for that. I think organizations that was at the foundation, many people would come and say, how do I get to DAFs? How do I get to people with DAFs? And what I need to tell them is the same thing. The DAF isn't it's a mechanism of giving, but the reason that they are giving goes back to a belief in your mission, being able to cultivate them and strategize with them and looking at how to get them involved. So I think people that have donor advised funds, it's good to know that you can research those through your foundations, but you still got to treat those individual donors are the same, because they're not going to give money to you until they are connected to your mission in some way. And so I think people always say, oh, well, the DAFs are over there, we should get some of that, but you still have to cultivate the folks in that way. Again, where we've had a benefit is that many artists now have DAFs that they didn't have before. So that has allowed them to give in a different way than they were before. And I do think that cultivating those relationships is really still the key, and then stewarding them afterwards.
Very good, very good. Other comments on a very popular topic? Jay?
Hey, John, I would just say, just like what Belinda said, you've got to cultivate the community foundation staff. This is the people that really know actually how many DAFs are out there. It's the greatest single mystery right now is who has a DAF and how do you get to them, because it is free money basically sitting out there with some guardrails around it. And we find the more conversations we can have with community foundation staff, financial planners, attorneys who will alert you to the people who have already set up a DAF, and here's what they're interested in supporting around that. So we spend a lot of time not only trying to figure out who's done DAFs, but also where are they, and building those relationships so we can hopefully make our case to get some of that funding.
Very good. An excellent point that money is already out there, but it's a question of then how do you access the donor to motivate them to give it to you as opposed to somebody else. But other comments, Rosalyn or Meredyth?
Sure, I can jump in and say, specific to our community foundation here of Greater Atlanta, I find they've taken more of an initiative-based collaborative approach. And they wouldn't say it this way, maybe to give their donors some cover, but rather to point them in a direction or an issue area that they care about. And so certainly since the pandemic, but in the past couple of years, affordable housing has been a real topic of focus, particularly here in our city, but across the nation. And so they have lifted up two different collaborative funding efforts, one known as the Worth Atlanta Home Ownership Collaborative, and the other is the Together ATL Affordable Housing Fund, where they're bringing together donors whose assets they manage, but also other major funders, foundations in the community to collate their resources and have a particular grant-making strategy, but also different mechanisms, whether those are traditional grants or concessional financing, forgivable loans. They've really taken a more innovative approach. So I think as a first pass, we've been able to realize some additional funding through those initiatives. And as folks see the results that we're getting, will raise their hand and say, you know what, I want to have a very specific one-on-one conversation as a donor here with Atlanta Habitat about how much more I can do. So that's been the approach locally here.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. Would you add anything, Mary? Yeah,
nothing,
let me ask.
Nothing that hasn't already been said.
Okay, go ahead, Belinda.
Well, I do want to remind us that we tend to, 20 years ago, you only thought of DAFs being at community foundations, but
right.
there are a tremendous amount of corporate resources for that and other financial institutions. So I would encourage looking at DAFs to also look at that, not only to work with their community foundations, but also to look at the organizations out there that have them, because they are a tremendous amount of the resources, and DAFs now are not just at community foundations, but other resources.
Well, let me pick up on that point, Belinda. When we look at some of those organizations now, the for-profit organizations that are trying to get into the DAF, it seems I've always felt that on one hand, they want to keep their money as much as possible, that they can manage it. And I don't know if there are ways to access those folks that are providing the financial counseling and everything else to encourage them to encourage their donors. How did you approach that at the Community Foundation?
You mean working with the other organizations that have DAFs, or
Working with we're working with the for-profit organizations, Ameriprise or those different kind of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of different things that happen. People who are very transactional in their giving tend to sometimes go to those for-profit organizations because they already have many times they have established relationships with them because they've been managing their money, and they say, well, if you want to put some aside to do that. So I do think that if that is a transaction, if they're really much more into that, they just want somebody to say send $5,000 or something to that, then that works for a donor very well. Where I think community foundations come into play a lot more is that many of those, there are different resources there that, as I think Rosalyn was saying, they can help direct them or collectively give. They can say, if you're looking at particular organizations, these are the types that you may look at, whereas the folks usually in the for-profit don't have the background of knowing what other organizations in your town provide affordable housing or the power of music. And so I think they are very distinctly two different things about doing it. And, you know, I'm a little prejudiced against community foundations, so I would always like that community-based help with them. We had resources to help them broader than that. The other things is many things that are DAFs will become eventually endowed funds down the road. They may have that in a plan. And currently, the for-profit organizations don't do that. They don't create scholarship funds. They don't do any of those other type of things that are that. So it's very transactional. So I think it's just your donors. Some donors like very transactional and hands off, and some want to know, where can I do and how do I make this be good 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years?
That's an excellent analysis. Thank you. One other question, the predicted great transfer of wealth to the next generation has seemed to stalled a little bit in that bequests are down. They were down by 1.6% in the Giving USA study. So I heard both Meredyth and I think Jay talking about how you've been able to kind of bring in the next generation and get them interested in giving. And so I'm wondering, that's kind of a two-part question. Here's a pot of accumulated money that older folks have had. And then there's the question of, do they make a choice about that, or do they send it down to their children who make a choice? And would that be the same? So I'd like to focus this sort of on our education folks here to see what their perspective is on that. Meredyth, could you start us off, and then I'll go to Jay?
So we definitely have been very intentional about making sure that whenever we're speaking with a donor about a gift, we are incorporating that element of planned giving in addition to a straight out gift to the school as well. I think that's an interesting question, John, about sort of how families are thinking about those funds. And I'm not sure I have not had a situation where donors are sort of saying to me, we're going to hold these funds and let my children decide what's happening to them. I would say that just that my two comments related to planned giving are that we're just making sure that we're always having the conversation and that we're documenting when one of the things that we have not, we've gotten much better at over the past year or so is making sure that we're documenting these conversations and getting the legal documents in line so that those planned gifts can come to fruition.
John, I would just say from our side of the street, much like what Meredyth just said, we try to show the impact and other donors in their situation making bequests to the university. What's the impact going to be? How does it look? How does it feel? We find when we share those experiences with people considering doing the same, that when they see it and can touch it a little bit and feel it from others, it moves that conversation along in a pretty strategic way where they get to think through, am I making the right decision by giving it now or passing it down to family members? We also involve a lot of people in the gift conversation. Depending on who it is, husband, wife for sure, other family members if we get a sense that they're a piece of the puzzle or need to be. So it depends on the different individuals you're talking to or families. But once you get an idea of who needs to be involved in the conversation, being intentional, like Meredyth said, of not only talking about a now gift, but also a planned gift is really the responsible thing to do.
So really sort of the process and the personalization is really key in that whole. Yes, I think demystifying sometimes how we go about some of these various gifts is very important, because I still think there's stereotypes out there about how we do it or how we're supposed to do it. And your comments are very much on target.
John, I would also say there's a lot of people that will indicate to us that we're in their will. I think we've all probably seen that. And then when you go to have that conversation with that individual, sometimes they want to tell you, sometimes they don't. But I think the most important responsible thing an organization can do is to understand how they want their gift to be used in the future, explain to them by documenting it, and really saying, this is what I want it to be used for, no matter when it's realized, is really important to get everybody kind of around the table and comfortable with saying that, because that's the best thing you can do from being donor-centric and actually fulfilling a donor's wishes, and then be able to tell that story to many others to say, had the conversation, here's where they wanted it to be, and here's what the impact was. We found this to be a pretty successful strategy.
Yeah, when I always talked about that, I always talked about what do you want your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered? That just opens the floodgates. And then you really get information that you can use in terms of how to take it to the next steps. But excellent points. Yes, please, Belinda.
Say that again, going back to community foundations, of having that experience with that, is a lot of the generational wealth is transferring to those in a different way than we did, because all donor advised funds have success, not all. They have plans for what happens generally after that. They can be a couple of things. They can become endowed to say, I really love the university and I want to contribute to that, so I want to have a planned gift for them later on. But also the successor advisors. The successor advisors are generally their children or somebody within their family. So those family legacy type of things, those things that are, multi-generations have gone to the school, working with a community foundation and understanding that, or if your donors have things at community foundations, knowing that they may be an avenue to give to you in a different way, I think is important for us to remember.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, so really the last question I'd like to pose to us is a little bit of the elephant in the room. It may not be as much of an elephant in the room for each of you, but I would like to pose it. And that is the current political environment, where we're looking at significant cuts being made in the public sector and finding their way down to the nonprofit sector, so that the public and government funds traditionally, and this may be more for certain sectors of the nonprofit sector, have made up a large amount of nonprofit budgets. In some cases, as much as 40, 50, 60% of the budgets. Certainly in higher education, we look for grants, different things like that. And so I'm wondering, as we look at that political environment and we see some of that instability, how are each of your institutions kind of preparing or responding to that? And I'll throw it open to whoever wants to go first.
I'll jump in first, John, because I think in some ways we're probably being in the immediate impacted the least, because we have no federal or state funding at Lovett. I think where we will start to feel it more is just in terms of those human services needs in the greater Atlanta community, and our donors wanting to help make the difference for those really important organizations. We're certainly going to see it with foundation giving. So I think it will be very indirect to us, and probably not the same kind of hit that either Belinda or Rosalyn would feel in their organizations. Or Jay.
Okay. Yeah, Rosalyn, you.
Yeah, I can jump in on that and say I think one of the most important things we've determined that we can do is just the monitoring of the families that we serve. To Meredyth's very point, I mean, we are serving working families that have really tight margins as is. So when child care centers are receiving funding cuts, that really does impact parents because now they're having to pay more of a premium to send their kids to the same place they've always gone, or same thing for after school programs and so forth. So as these federal cuts have a direct impact on the people that we serve, we're just keeping our finger on the pulse so that we can take that perspective to our lawmakers, by example, to help provide perspective about what's really happening here on the ground, but also to take that perspective to funders. We talked about foundations earlier feeling that tug of really providing the stopgap funding, particularly to health and human service organizations that are feeling most of these cuts. So we can certainly affirm and underscore that, the importance and urgency of their response as we see the fallout with families that we're serving. I will tell you, as a nonprofit business, we're actually among the few that have little reliance on federal funding, which may sound ironic for a housing organization. We do have a close relationship with the Atlanta Housing Authority here, and the main funding mechanism they provide to us is down payment assistance. And that is really important to our mission. Even though it's a small portion of our revenue pie, it is how we close the gap between the cost or appraisal of that home to what the home buyer can afford to pay. So thankfully, we've maintained that funding for now, but as we set our next 3 to 5 year strategy, we think about how else might we source down payment assistance or create that funding mechanism inside of our organization in case it dries up down the line.
Very good. Belinda or Jay, anything to add?
Yes, at the beginning of the year, when some of the tariffs and stuff was coming out, we heard a little more chatter from the corporate community than we did that of, well, we don't know what's going to happen. We're going to hold back of where it is. We don't, again, receive direct funding from the government either. We do it through other mechanisms. So I do think that in times of crisis, people do tend to go to basic needs. They want to take things that they know, feeding people, housing people, those kind of things. I think it just reiterates that no matter what it is, if it's a pandemic or it's a political environment or it's a disaster environment, we have to continue to work with our donors and cultivate them and to steward them and keep them informed, because that will change. That environment will change.
Good point. Good point.
And we don't want to have lost our relationship with them if they say, I can't get to you this year. That's great. Thank you for doing what you're doing for the community. Let us keep telling you what's happening. So, you know, I'm of old school. John, you and I've been doing this a little while, and I'm always you go back to the basics. And I've said that 2 or 3 times on here, because I think that is going to sustain you, because there's always going to be something that impacts it.
Very good. Jay, any comment on that?
Yeah, John, I would just say this is the huge elephant in the room for higher ed right now. When you look at research dollars, University of South Florida a couple of years ago was lucky to get into the AAU. We're one of 71 institutions across the United States that are in this high research R1 activity for universities. And so the funding from NSF, NIH, all that is out there that is being held up or being considered to be reapportioned is really challenging. But I actually think it's an opportunity for us in the fundraising side of the street to actually go out and tell the story about why research is so important, all the new discoveries that have, led the United States to be where they are, whether it's in defense, in medicine, food, you name it. So it's a big opportunity to tell a new story about why funding research, when the federal government may not be in that business as much as it used to be, is a really good opportunity for people. So it's something we deal with every day, and we're trying to think through bigger, better strategies.
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent comment and maybe an excellent way to close our conversation, and that is the role that nonprofit organizations play in our culture and our society. We often refer to it as the third sector or the independent sector. And I think the ability to educate, as Belinda was saying, regardless of what times there are, about the importance of the nonprofit sector. And you've helped us, each of you have helped us today to really see how to do that, especially when it comes to raising the funds and the resources that we need to continue to prosper and to serve our constituencies and the community. So on behalf of Lighthouse Counsel, I want to thank each of you so much for taking the time and being such wonderful panelists. I didn't have to cut any of you off. You were just so right to the point. And I just hope, please send this out to anybody you think would be helpful, because I think it was just a marvelous and excellent discussion. Thank each of you. Continue to have a great day and a good year.
Thank you.
Thank
John.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Laura Manning, Director of Partnerships and Programs for Lighthouse Counsel. Thank you for joining us for this year's Giving USA briefing. Lighthouse Counsel partners with respected nonprofits to develop and implement strategies that increase mission awareness, organizational effectiveness, and philanthropic support. Our work focuses on 4 core areas: fundraising, strategic planning, board development, and leadership development. We invite you to connect with us on LinkedIn to stay informed and inspired. If we can support your organization in any way, we'd be privileged to do so. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again, and our very best to you as you continue your important work.